So you're probably really looking forward to building out this Trello clone, but very briefly, I want to talk about how you can best use clones in order to learn JavaScript quicker and in order to really cement your JavaScript knowledge. Because if you just build an exact one-to-one replica of another project, sure, you're going to learn quite a bit along the way, but you're also more than likely going to be wasting 90 to 95% of the time that you build that project because you already really thoroughly understand how to do certain things of that clone. And that 90 to 95% of the time that you're working on things like CSS or HTML or JavaScript that you already know is not helping you actually further your skills as a developer, and it's just wasting your time essentially. It's cool to be able to build these things, and if your only goal is just to build the clone and not care about learning, sure, that's fine. But most likely your goal is to really further your learning. So it's important that when you want to build a clone or a similar site to something that already exists, take a look at that site and figure out one of two things. Either one, what is the most important and core aspect of that site? Like the one thing that you think of when you think of that site. And two, think about the thing from that site that you are most interested in learning about or something that you want to include in your own project. Generally, number two is the best way to go. But if you don't really know what you want to learn, you just kind of want to build something cool, going with option one and picking the core thing from that site is another great way to learn. So with Trello, when you go to Trello, probably the thing that is most common that sticks out to you is like the column layout that they have, as well as the ability to drag items between the list and have that save and update and all that fun stuff. That's probably the most common thing you think of when you think of Trello. The ability to add things to list, update, assign things to people. I mean, this stuff is everywhere. It's not really the thing that's core to Trello. And in this tutorial, the thing that we're going to be focusing on learning and building out is a custom drag and drop system. So while this is not full-blown every single thing that's in Trello, this is still a really thorough and intense project. It's going to be a pretty long one, and it's going to go over an entire custom drag and drop feature, which is really the most core and important aspect of Trello itself. So with all of that said, I really hope you're able to figure out how to best choose clones for yourself when you're learning, and I hope that you enjoy this Trello clone. So like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we're really going to be focusing on the drag and drop functionality of this Trello clone. But as you can see on the right-hand side of my screen, we essentially have the finished product. This is the finished product, and this over here is going to be the starting project. I can't drag any of these. There's no JavaScript on this. This is the starting HTML and CSS that you can download down below this video. In the finished version, we have the ability to add new tasks. I can type in new task here, hit enter, and it creates a new task for me. I can drag tasks around, as you can see, they get this nice little animation, and you can see they have the drop location that's being highlighted. So I could drop this here, for example, and when I refresh, all of this information is being saved locally. So as you can see, it doesn't matter where I move these, every single time I refresh, they're going to show up in the exact place that they should be. Now these tasks are not able to be edited or deleted. The only thing you can do is drag them around and create new ones, such as this. Those are the only two features of this application. But the core of this application is all about that drag and drop functionality because it's a lot more involved than you may initially think. So building out and learning that is much more important than doing deleting and editing because you've already done that. You know how to build the to-do list. We're not here to focus on that. So we're going to focus purely on the drag and drop functionality. Also, here's the starting HTML that we have. Let me just close out of this so we have just our starting version here. And as you can see, we just have some tasks, some really simple HTML and CSS that's rendering out everything that we see on the right-hand side of our screen. And right now you'll notice that mine only takes up half the screen. You can make it expand to 100% of the screen by just changing this CSS section where it says height, change it to 100, and now you'll have that more Trello-like experience where it fills the full screen. But since my camera is down in the bottom right-hand corner, I just have it taken up 50% so you can see everything I'm working on, as well as the camera. So to get started, obviously the first thing we need to do is just get a JavaScript file running. And I'm going to set up Parcel for this just because we're going to be using libraries from NPM and modules. So setting up Parcel immediately is probably a good idea. You can just say npm I -- save dev parcel bundler. And I'm going to get back to you when this finishes because it takes quite a while. Okay, so that just finished up, and you may have noticed that I actually didn't initialize npm and create a package JSON. We can still do that by saying npm init and just doing the -y to get all the defaults. And that's going to create our package JSON for us. And if we come in here, you're going to notice we have a bunch of dependencies, which we really don't need any of these dependencies. And that's just because these are all dependencies brought in by Parcel. What we can do is just clear out all these dependencies in here, just like this. And then all we need to do is save this file and rerun the saving of Parcel Bundler. It's not going to re-download anything because it's already all downloaded, but it is going to add this to our package JSON inside the dev dependencies section, which is exactly what we want. So it should rather quickly go ahead and get everything set up so that we have parcel inside of our dev dependencies. There we go, it just finished up. And that's just how you would fix this if you accidentally created your package.json after you did your downloads of Node modules. You just re-download them, it'll add them to your package.json just like you want. Now let's set up our start script, which is just going to be here, parcel index.html, and we're going to have our build script for if we were to build and deploy this. And we're going to do parcel build index.html. There we go. We don't have to touch package.json anymore, and we can go directly into creating our first JavaScript file. Let's just create a file called script.js, and I'm also going to create a file here called drag and drop.js. Whoops, make sure I spell that correctly. .js, there we go. And the reason that I have a separate drag and drop file from our script is that if you think about it, this application is almost two separate parts. We have the ability to save these to-do lists so that when we refresh our page, they're still there. We have the ability to add new to-do lists. We have the ability to drag them and drop them and so on. But those are kind of separate. Our drag and drop functionality is completely different than all of our saving and adding and editing stuff. So I want the drag and drop code to essentially only take care of dragging and dropping. That way, if I were to create a new application that needed drag and drop functionality, I could just use this exact JavaScript file, bring it into my new project, and it would work just fine. I wouldn't have to change anything. So I want this to be essentially able to be added to any project that I create, not just tied to this one exact project. So that's going to be the main focus of this drag and drop file. This script file, on the other hand, is just going to contain all the logic for adding new tasks, saving our task, loading our task, all of that fun stuff. So pretty easy stuff compared to the drag and drop. So there are actually a couple ways that we could implement drag and drop inside of HTML and JavaScript. One way is by using the native HTML drag and drop API, but unfortunately it's very limited and it's more so meant for like dragging files onto the browser for like uploading. It's not really meant for dragging items around a list. You can use it for that, but it's really not meant for it and it's not versatile enough for it. So instead we're just going to implement completely custom drag and drop functionality. So the best thing to do is to think about how we're going to create this drag and drop. Essentially, what are the steps that we need to do in order to figure out how a drag and drop works? If you think about it, you go over to an item, you click on it with your mouse, and while you hold your mouse down, you move it to where you want to drop it, and you let go. That's it. It's essentially push mouse down, move mouse, lift mouse up. Those are the only three actions that you take to do drag and drop. So in order to figure out how to drag and drop an item, we need to first capture the mouse going down, we need to capture it moving around, and we need to capture when you let go of the mouse button. And luckily with JavaScript, we have events called mouse down, mouse up, and mouse move, which just do all three of those for us. So what we want to do inside our drag and drop file is set up a listener for when we click our mouse on an element that can be dragged. And you may immediately think, okay, well, each one of these divs has a class task, and we'll just use that task to figure out what we drag and drop. But remember when I said that we want drag and drop to be versatile where we can use it in any project that we create? Well, if we use the class task, then we would have to put that class of task on things that we use in the other project. And maybe they're not tasks. Maybe you're ordering files, for example. It wouldn't make sense to have the class task. So instead, I want to just use a custom data attribute called data draggable. This is something that we can add to each one of our tasks. I'm just going to do that now. Scroll through each one of these. There's one and one right there. That's all four of the tasks. So now we have this custom data attribute, which we can put in any project we create. It makes sense. It explains exactly what's going on. And it doesn't require us to use this class that is really only pertaining to this one application. Then in our drag and drop, we can select those different items. But you remember how I also mentioned we have the ability to add new items? Well, we can't just, select all the items and loop through them and put event listeners on them because it won't take care of all the new items we add. So instead, we need to set up a global event listener, which is something we've done multiple times before. I'm just going to put in a utils file. So we'll do utils as our folder. And we're going to create a new file called add global event listener.js, just like that. And inside of here, all I want to do is export a default function called add global event listener. And all this is going to take is going to take the type of event that we're going to be creating. It's going to take the selector, and it's going to take the callback. And all we want to do is set an event on our document. So we're going to add an event listener to our document of the specific type. And then inside of here, we're going to have a callback, which is going to take in the event. And we can see if the target, which is the thing that we're clicking on or pushing our mouse down or dragging our mouse around, if it matches the selector, then we want to call the callback. That's it. And I also want to make sure we pass in the event that happened. So all we're doing is if the target matches, we'll call the callback. So that way, if we were to set up an event listener with a selector for our data draggable, we can make sure that it's going to run for all of the current ones on the page and any new ones that get added. So inside of our drag and drop, let's just import that add global event listener from, and this is coming from utils slash, and it's not, here we go, there we go, // utils / add global event listener .js, just like that. And then we can just say add global event listener. Our type, we want to do mouse down, because if you remember, I said we want to trigger whenever we click our mouse down on a class data draggable. So we'll do mouse down. Then we're going to do here our selector of data draggable, since we only want this to happen on the things that we can drag. And then we have our actual event. And let's just do console.log mouse down. There we go. And now in order to run this, we need to import it in our script file. So let's just create a simple function, which is going to be our default export, and we're just going to call it setup. And all this function is going to do is add our event listeners. Then in our script, we can just import setup, drag and drop from / drag and drop .js, just like that. And we can call it setup, drag, and drop. And make sure I call this setup. And if we call that as a function, and I import this script at the top of our file up here, we just say here that we're going to have script.js, and we want to defer this. This is all the code we need in order to get that hooked up. And just to kind of reiterate exactly what's happening, all we're doing is importing this script file. And the script file right now, all it's doing is importing this other file and running the setup function, which inside that setup function, we're just adding an event listener for all of our data draggables. And every time we click mouse down, we're logging out mouse down. So let's see if this actually worked. Let's call npm start in order to start up our application. And it should start it up on this port. So let's open that up right over here, as you can see. And now if I inspect the page, we can view the console. And then I click on an element, you can see we get mouse down being printed. If I click somewhere else that's not one of our data draggables, you notice it doesn't log anything. But if I click any of these data draggables, it's logging out mouse down. So we're now capturing that mouse down portion. The next thing we need to do is be able to capture when we move our mouse, and then finally when we release our mouse. So let's come into here, and what we can do is we want to set up an event listener for when our mouse moves. Well, we just need to set that on the document, because our mouse could be moving down here, it could be moving up at the top of our application. We can't say just when it's moving over, our data draggable, because that won't always be the case. We could be moving somewhere else. So we just want to set this up on the document. We're just going to say document, add event listener, mouse, move, and we want it to do something. And you may think we'll just write our function in here like console.log moved, and you may think this is fine, but if I inspect the page, I go over to our console, and I move my mouse, nothing happens. When I click on this, and now when I move, you see it's printing out move every time I move, and now when I click on this again, it's printing move twice as fast. You can't really see that, but what's happening is it's adding a new event listener every time I click my mouse down, and it's not ever removing those event listeners. So instead, what I need to do is just create a function, and we'll just call this const mouse move function equals, and we'll just make this an arrow function, and in here, console.log moved. Okay, so now I can just put this mouse moved function here. So I'm just putting a reference to the function is what we're adding for our event listener. And now when I release my mouse, essentially when I put my mouse up, what I want to do is I want to remove this event listener. So we can just add another event listener for on mouse up. This is going to just be on our document because we don't care where our mouse is. As long as we lift it up, we want to stop dragging. And in here, all we want to do is just take our document. We want to remove the event listener that we currently have for mouse down that is associated with our mouse move function. I'm sorry, mouse move here, not mouse down. And then we just can do a console.log up. And let's also do console.log down. So we can see when we press down, we can see when we move, and we can see when we lift up. So let's just inspect and see what this looks like. Go to the console, click down, we get down. As I move with my mouse down, it's printing out moved. When I lift up, we get up. And now if I move my mouse, it doesn't print move anymore until I click on another one of these tasks and drag my mouse around and then lift up. You will notice though that this up is being printed twice. And if we did another move, it'd be printed 3 times. And the reason for this is essentially we're adding this event listener and never removing it, but we only ever want this event listener to occur once. So we can pass in a third option here, put once true, and that just essentially says run this event once and then immediately remove it. So now if I inspect our page, go to the console again, drag around, lift up, it says up, drag around, lift up, it says up again, and is only ever printing out up once, which is exactly what we want. So I can just close out of this. Essentially, we have the core of our drag and drop done already. If you think about it, drag and drop is just putting the mouse down, moving it around, and then lifting the mouse up. But clearly, our drag and drop is not finished yet because we actually need to make sure that we can drag an item from one lane to the next and so on. We need to be able to reposition these items. So the next step for us is to actually make it so when we click on an item and start dragging it, it'll move with our mouse cursor. So I'm just going to create a new function. We're going to call this position clone. And all this is going to do is position the clone of the element that we're dragging around. And the reason that we're actually cloning the element is because I don't want to just up and remove this element and position it absolutely and all of that stuff. I'd rather just keep this element as is, create a brand new clone that we move, and just hide the element until we move it to a new location and then we re-add it to that location. Sounds a little bit confusing right now, but it'll make much more sense once I show you exactly what's going on. So for now, up here inside of our mouse down event, let's just create that clone. In order to create the clone, we first need to get the item we're dragging. So we'll just say const selected item is equal to e.target. This is the item that we've clicked on. Then we can create an item clone, which is just going to be our selected item.clone node, and we want to put in true here. So we clone everything that has to do with the item that we're dragging. This is going to be an exact replica of the item that we're dragging. Then all we need to do is take our selected item. We're going to get the classes on it, so we'll get the class list, and all we're going to do is add the hide class. This is going to remove it so that we can't actually see the item anymore. And then what I want to do up here in our mouse up function is I just want to make sure that we re-add this. So we'll say selected item dot class list dot remove hide. So now if I click down on an element, you'll see it disappears, and as soon as I lift up, it's going to reappear. And that's just because we're using the dot hide class right here, which just turns the display to none. We also have a dragging class we can add to things we're dragging, as well as a ghost class, which is going to give us that nice, highlight area of where we're going to be dropping the element. I called that the ghost. These three classes are going to be really handy to use inside of our JavaScript. So now that we're able to hide and show any of the items that we click on, the next thing I want to do is take our item clone and I want to be able to move it to where our cursor is. So that's what this position clone function is doing. It's going to take in the item clone and it's going to take in our mouse events as well. In order to make this more self-explanatory than E, we'll call this mouse position. Then what we want to do up here is we can get our mouse position from E. So to see what's inside of E, let's just do a console.log of E. Inspect our page, go over to the console. Let's do a quick click here. And as you can see inside of here, we have a bunch of information for our mouse event. But the most important things that we really care about is the position of where our mouse is. If we scroll up, you can see this client X and client Y. This is going to give us the position of our mouse instead of the client, which is the browser. So that's exactly what we want. So what we can do, we just scroll down to position clone. If position clone gets called with our clone and our E, our event, which is our mouse position, we can set the position of our clone by saying item clone dot style dot top, and we just want to set that equal to our mouse position dot client Y converted to pixels. We can do the exact same thing for the left side, but we want to convert the X position to pixels. That's all we need to do to position our clone. So up here, we can just say position clone, pass in the item clone and E. And now if we save this and I click on this item, you can see right now nothing's happening. The reason for that is we never added our item clone to our page. So we of course need to do that next. We'll say document.body.append, and we're just going to append our item clone. So now if I click on here, you can see that again, this is not quite what we wanted, showing up way down here for some reason. The reason for this is simple. I don't have the class of dragging being applied to this. So for our item clone, we can just say class list.add dragging. Now, if I drag on an item, you can see it gets positioned exactly where my cursor is. The top left goes exactly where my cursor is for every single one of these, wherever I click. So that's super great. One thing that's not so great though, is that they're all sticking around. We want to delete these whenever we're done dragging. So all the way down here in the mouse up, I just want to take item clone and I just want to remove it. So now if I click on this, I can move my mouse, and as soon as I let go, the clone is going to disappear and the item is going to go back to where it was. The only step left is to make our mouse move function, take in the event it needs, and we can just position our clone. Exact same code. We have our item clone, and our E, instead of our mouse move function, is going to be the updated position for when we move our mouse. So now, if I hold and move my mouse, you can see the top left corner of this is following me every single place that I go, and as soon as I let go, it disappears and shows up over here. That's really great, but one slight problem is that when we click on this, we don't want the top left corner to be where our cursor is. We want it to be wherever we click inside this item. So if we click on the D, I want the D to be where my cursor is and where I move this around from instead of, top left corner up here. Now, in order to do this, it's actually pretty straightforward. All we need to do is get the dimensions of this box, determine where the top left corner of this box is, determine where our mouse is, and then determine the distance between those two. Because if we click on the D, for example, and let's say this D is 5 pixels downward from the top of the box, and it's 10 pixels to the right of the left side of the box. All we need to do is when we click on this, instead of putting the top left corner right where our mouse is, what we need to do is make it so that the top left corner is 5 pixels to the left, or actually 10 pixels to the left of our mouse and 5 pixels up, and that would put us right where this D is here. So in order to do that, we want to get the dimensions of the box of the item we're clicking. We can do that fairly easily by just coming in here and we create a variable. We'll just call it original rect, and that's just equal to selected item dot get bounding client rect. This is going to give us dimensions of our box, and we'll just log that out real quick to see what we're working with. Inspect the page, go to the console, and when I click on this, you can see we get this DOM rect, which has a bottom, height, left, right, top, width, X, and Y. The important things in our case are going to be the top and the left, because we want to make sure we offset from the top left corner of this. So to get our offset, we'll just create a variable called offset, and we're going to have an X offset, and we're going to have a Y offset. And for our X offset, we're just going to get where our mouse position is, which if you remember is our client X, and we're just going to subtract the rectangle left side from that. That's going to give us an offset that we can use. Same exact thing for the top. We'll do e.client y minus the original rectangle dot top. And now we have our offset created, and we can pass this offset to the position of our clone. And just to see exactly what the offset is, let's just print that out. So if we come in here and inspect the page on console, and if I click on this, you can see our offset has an X of 115 and a Y of 14. If we click really close to the top left corner, you can see our offset is almost 0. But if we click all the way in the bottom right corner, our offset is pretty large because it's offset the distance from the top left corner of our box. It's exactly what we want. So instead of our position clone, way down here, we can just take our offset in, and all we want to do is subtract our offset. So offset.y and offset.x. So now if I save this and drag the item, you can see it's not quite working as I would expect. And the main reason for that is when we position our clone instead of our mouse move, we also need to pass in this offset. There we go. Now when I drag an item, you can see that the item is being dragged based on where I clicked. So if I click on the V, you can see that we're technically not dragging from the V. And the reason for that is that this item shrinks down in size. It doesn't actually stay its same original size. So we need to fix that problem. Because if I click up here in the top left corner, you can see it's in the top left. If I click kind of on the right side, it shows up on the right side. So our dragging is right. But the problem is that our box is shrinking when we move it to the drag mode and then re-expanding to fill the full width. So we want to make sure our clone stays the same width as the original rectangle we have. Well, we have the dimensions of our rectangle. We have our clone. Let's just do that. Item clone dot style dot width is going to be equal to our original rectangle dot width converted to pixels. Now, when we drag an item, it stays the exact width as what it was before, no matter how big or tall it was. And you'll also notice my cursor stays in the same position when I move the item. So if I click on the U, we're on the U, which is exactly what I would expect. Same over here, click on R, our cursor is right on the R. So that offset worked amazingly. So now before we get too much further into this drag and drop functionality, you may notice this code's kind of a mess. We have almost everything inside of this one global event listener, and it's really confusing to look at. So I want to clean up this code a little bit. And when you're going about and refactoring code, the best thing to do is look at, your ugliest pieces of code, which in our case is this really long, kind of lengthy function here, and figure out what it's doing. So if we look at this, we're creating a few items here. Okay, we're kind of just like setting up what we need to work with. That's this section right here. Then if we scroll down a little further, we're creating all of the different items we're using for dragging. As you can see, we have our clone here. We're kind of like setting up our position of everything, hiding the things we need to hide, adding the dragging class. And then down here, this bottom section, all we're really doing is creating and adding event listeners. So we kind of have like an event section. We have like a basic setup function. And then we have like the actual setup of each one of our items after we initialize them. So what I think this is essentially 3 different sections. This initialization is probably fine to keep inside of the event listener itself because it's kind of needed everywhere. But this setup section and this event listener section, we can move into their own functions. I'm going to create a function, function called setup drag items. And this is going to be for that setup section right here where we modify our clone and where we hide our selected item here. So we need to pass both of those in. We're going to pass in our selected item and our item clone. Clone. And also, I pretty much want to keep our offset inside of there as well as this rectangle section. So I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to put it inside of setup drag items, which means we also need to pass in our event itself. So let's make sure we pass that in because we use that event right here to create our offset. Then what we can do is copy all of this code. We can drag it down into our setup drag items. And I just want to make sure I organize this slightly better. We're going to put all the stuff associated with our selected item at the top. Then we're going to have our item clone next. And then at the very bottom, I just want to return our offset. And the reason for that is that if we look up here, we use this offset inside of the event listener section. So now we can just say our offset is equal to setup drag items. If we save this, we should have everything working. And before I refactor this event section, I want to just make sure that this refactor worked first. So let's test everything. We click, drag, it didn't work. So clearly we're doing something wrong. Let's just inspect to see what the problem is. And you can see if we go to the console, it says, cannot read property get bound in client rect of undefined. And that's occurring right here, const offset equals setup drag items. And the reason for this is down here, it's saying selected item is undefined. So if we scroll up to where we call setup drag items, you notice I forgot to pass everything to it. So we'll pass in selected item, pass in item clone, and we'll pass in our event. So now we drag these items, you can see it worked just like it did before. So this section, done. We refactored it out and it already looks so much cleaner. Next step is to refactor all of this code. So let's create a function for it. Come down here, function setup drag events. Just like that, make sure I spell this correctly. And all we need to do inside of here is copy the code that we have up here. So I'll just, copy this real quick. We'll make sure we call setup drag events, and I'll put the code inside of here. It looks like we have an error somewhere along the way. Let me just see. Oh, I forgot to close this off. I copied a little bit too much code. Get rid of that. There we go. That cleaned up all of our different errors. And now we need to see what we need to pass in here. We need our offset. We need to have our item clone, and we need our selected item. So we're going to pass in our selected item. We're going to have our item clone. We're going to have our offset. And I think that's everything that we need for setup drag events. So up here, when we call it, we need to pass in our selected item, our item clone, and our offset. And let's see if this works. We drag the item, let go. It appears to work. Let's just make sure we inspect the console, make sure there's no errors. Console. And as you can see, there's no errors. Up is still being printed. So it looks like everything is working as we would expect. So now we pretty much have everything for the dragging portion of our feature done. We can click on an item and we can drag it around. That's great, but right now we don't have any ability to drop it, and we can't see where we're dropping that item in the list. There's no, placeholder ghost image that's showing us where we would be placing this item. So those are kind of the main things we want to work on next when it comes to the drag and drop. And in my opinion, the best place to start would be the ghost feature, because that's quite a bit easier than implementing the entire drop ability. Also, if we have a ghost image that shows us where this is going to be dropped, it makes implementing the drop much easier because we can just drop it in exactly where the ghost image is. So the ghost is kind of almost required in order to build out the drop functionality. So I want to build the ghost feature. And the ghost is just going to be, again, a clone of the current item we're on. So I just want to say ghost is equal to our selected item dot clone node. And you may think we need to pass true in here to get all of the descendants, but something interesting about the ghost is we don't care about the content in the ghost. We're going to delete the text. We're going to delete everything in the ghost. All we want is a box, essentially. We just want a box that's the same size as the item we're dragging. That's it. So we don't care about the HTML inside of it. So we have our ghost, and we're going to be setting that ghost up here. So let's just pass our ghost in. to the setup drag. And down in here, where we set up our drag items, we're going to take in the ghost, and we kind of need to do a lot of the same stuff we're doing here, but for our ghost. The first thing I want to do is take the class list, and I want to add the class ghost. And if you remember right, that's this class right here. It's just essentially creating that droppable looking zone. Then I want to remove everything inside of here, all the text, all the HTML. We can just say inner HTML is equal to nothing. We just want to clear out the ghost completely. And then lastly, I want to insert the ghost into the page, exactly where the current item we're dragging is, at least to start. So what I can do is I can take our selected item, and what I can do is I can get the parent of this, which is just the parent element, and then I want to say I want to insert an element into the parent, and I want it to be before another element. So we use the insert before function. We want to insert the ghost, and we want to insert it before the selected item. And the reason that this works is that we're getting the parent of the selected item and telling it to insert a child. We're saying the ghost is the child, and we want to insert it before our selected item. But since we're hiding our selected item, if we insert it before the selected item, it'll show up in the same place as the item we just selected. Sounds a little bit confusing, but trust me, it's going to work. We save this, and I go to drag this do laundry. You can see that we have the ghost showing up there, that little gray bar. Right now it's really small, it's not the right size, but you can see the ghost is there. And when I let go of this, unfortunately the ghost doesn't disappear, but you can see I'm constantly adding a new ghost directly above the item that I just dragged. So the next step is to make sure the ghost stays the same height as the item that we click on. So to do that, we can just come in here and say ghost.style.height, and we want to do essentially the same thing we did up here. For the width, I'm just going to copy the width, and instead of doing width, we're going to do the height. Now when I drag this, you can see we have a box left behind that is the exact same size as the item we're dragging. Same with here. And it's always showing up directly above the item we're dragging, so it looks like it's the same places where the item is dragging came from. All we need to do is make sure we remove this ghost when we lift our mouse up. So when we set up our drag event, what we do is just pass the ghost in there, scroll down in here, set up drag events, take in the ghost, and in our mouse up, we can just say ghost.remove, just like we did for the item clone. We can even get rid of this log down here. It's not really needed anymore. Now when I drag, let go, the ghost disappears, and this goes to it. Also, you may notice that this kind of set of code right here is essentially us canceling or stopping our drag event. So I'm going to put them in their own function. We can just come down here and say function stop drag. And all this is going to do is take in our selected item, our item clone, and our ghost. So selected item, item clone, and ghost, and it's just going to run this code right here. We'll copy and paste this down here, and we'll say stop drag of our selected item, item clone, and ghost. So now if I save this, just to make sure, drag an item, it still works as before, which is great. And you'll notice over here, this item shows up larger because we're dragging a taller item. So the ghost image is the right size. That's really important and really useful. So that's all it takes to create this ghost-like image. The next step is going to be making that ghost move. So when I drag over to the doing column, the ghost follows. Drag to the done column, it follows me over there. And to do that, we need to determine where our drop targets are. Essentially, where can we drop this off? We can only drop it inside of these 3 columns, and we need to be able to specify that, because I don't want to be able to drop my edit item way down here below my list. It needs to be within one of these lists. So in order to denote a drop zone, just like I did with our data draggables, I want each one of our tasks, which is our list of items, to have that. So I'm just going to collapse this down so you can see we have these 3 sections called tasks, which contain our tasks. These are where I want to be able to drop an item. So we'll say data drop zone. This is where we can drop something. I'm going to put this on each one of our classes here that have tasks. And again, this is for reusability purposes and to be explicit. Tasks is not really explicit that this is a drop zone, but a data attribute called drop zone, very explicit. Now back into here, we can set up our code so that way our event, or our ghost, is going to move with us into each one of these different drop zones. So in order to do that, inside of our mouse move function, we need to get the drop zone we're currently over. And the easiest way we can do that is by looking at the target of our E. Let's just say console.log e.target. And we can come over here. Let's do a quick inspect console, and let's just move this item a little bit. We're going to get a lot of stuff being printed out. And as you can see, for the most part, this div with the class of tasks and data drop zone is being printed. But if we hover over our do laundry instead, you'll notice it's printing out the task. Essentially, the target is whatever we're currently hovered over with our mouse move event. And in our case, it's either going to be a task or it's going to be the drop zone that the task is inside of. So what we want to do is take the current target and figure out if it's a drop zone or if it's inside of a drop zone. Because if we hover over the do laundry task, we're still inside of the drop zone of the task parent overall. So we're going to create a function that's going to get us our drop zone. Let's call it get drop zone. And we're going to pass it in our e.target. Then in that function, get drop zone, which is going to take in a random element, we're going to see if this element itself is a drop zone. So if element dot matches data drop zone, then we know this is a drop zone and we can return it. So we can say return element. Otherwise, if this isn't a drop zone, we can come in here and we can say that we want to get the closest drop zone that this is a parent of. So we'll say element.closest data drop zone. And the reason for this second step where we're returning the closest parent as a drop zone is because if we hover over, for example, a task right here, we're still inside of the drop zone, but our target is going to be this child of the drop zone. So we're going to look to see if we're inside of a drop zone, essentially. Is the parent of the element we're on, or one of the parents of the element we're on, a drop zone? If so, we're inside the drop zone. So that's essentially all we need to do to get a drop zone, and we should always have our drop zone being printed out here. Then what we can do is after we position our clone, because we always want to move our clone, we can say if our drop zone is equal to null, I just want to return because we don't want to go any further. We don't have a drop zone. We're not in a drop zone, so we can't update our ghost position. Otherwise, I want to update the position of our ghost to be wherever it needs to be, whether it's in the doing list or the done list and so on. To do this is actually really easy. We can just take our drop zone and we can just append our ghost inside of it. That's going to take the ghost from wherever it is right now and move it to the new drop zone. So let's see if this works. We drag this item, our ghost is here. We drag over here, our ghost follows. Drag over here, our ghost follows. And even if we're inside of a task like this record, for example, or this do laundry, it still follows because it's going up to the parent element. So this is working as we would expect. But right now we can only add to the bottom of a list. If I pull it above the plan Trello, or if in here I pull into the middle of these two items, it's not showing up in the correct place. It's only showing up in the bottom, which is definitely not exactly what we want. So I want to make sure that this ghost shows up in between the do laundry and the edit, or above record if I'm above it, and only show up at the bottom if it's down here. We're dragging our item all the way down here. For me, the best way to do this is to determine if when we're dragging something, our cursor is halfway above the halfway point of whatever item is the next one on the list. So this edit video, once our cursor goes above the halfway point of edit video, I want the item to now be in between these two. And when I go above the halfway point of do laundry, I want it to now be at the top of our list. So whenever we pass the halfway point of an element, move us above it or below it. That's what I want to do. So a pretty easy way to do that is inside of here. Instead of just appending this to the bottom of our drop zone, we need to loop through the children in that drop zone and figure out, based on their position, where we are in coordination to them. So what we can do inside of here is get the children of our drop zone. So we can say drop zone dot children, and we want to convert this to an array. So we'll just say array dot from, and that allows us to use the dot find method, and we can loop through each child. And for each child, what we can do is get their rectangle, essentially their client bounding rectangle, by just saying child dot get bounding client rect, and then we can return here. We want to see if the position of our mouse, which is our client y, that's going to be our vertical position of our mouse. We want to see if it's less than the top of the rectangle. That would give us essentially true if we're anywhere below the top of the rectangle. But instead, what I want to do is I also want to subtract half of the height. And the way that top works is it gets larger as you go down. So we just need to add half of the rectangle height. So rectangle height divided by 2. This is going to return to us whatever child we are currently above. So what we can do is just call this the closest child is equal to that. And then if we have a closest child, so if, whoops, closest child is not equal to null, then all we want to do is take our drop zone and we want to use that insert before method. And we're going to insert our ghost before the child that we're directly above. So this is our closest child. Otherwise, we're just going to append it to the end. If we have no child that we're above, then that means we just put it at the end of the list. So now if I drag this over here, it shows up at the bottom. Once I get to the halfway point of record video, you can see we bump to the top. And once I go below the halfway point of record video, I go back to the bottom. Same thing over here. Halfway point, I go in between. Halfway point, I'm above. And I can do the same thing to go down. And once I'm down, it just doesn't matter. You're at the bottom of the list, so it's going to append it to the very bottom because there's nothing that you're currently above. And if I let go of this, obviously it's going back to the beginning. That's the next thing we're going to work to implement. This may seem really complicated. Oh man, we have to move this item from one place to another. That's going to be difficult. But actually, since we've set all this up already, it's actually really, really easy to do. All we need to do is come all the way here inside of our mouse up. So when we let go of our mouse, we want to remove that mouse move. We want to cancel our drag. And then in between these, we want to get to the drop zone. So we'll say drop zone. And instead of getting the drop zone for where our mouse is currently at, we want to get the drop zone of where our ghost image is at. So we're going to say get drop zone for our ghost. This is going to say what drop zone is our ghost currently in. Then we're just going to do a quick double check to make sure that our ghost is in a drop zone, because if it's not, that would be really bad. So if we're inside of a drop zone, then all we need to do is take our drop zone and we need to insert before. We need to insert our selected item and we insert it before our ghost. So all we're doing is we're taking the item that's currently hidden, moving it to directly before our ghost, and then we remove our ghost, so it essentially takes the place of our ghost. That's all it takes. If I come over here, drag edit video over, boom, I just moved it. Drag over plan Trello, boom, it just takes the place of that ghost item. So all of that planning work that we did beforehand allowed us to really easily just be able to write essentially 3 lines of code, and boom, we moved around any of the elements inside of our list directly to where that ghost is, just by all of the planning we did throughout the rest of our application. So you may think, great, we're done. This is complete, we did Trello. And you'll probably notice that there's a lot of time left in this video still, and that's because all we've done is implement the ability to pick up an item and move it somewhere, which is the core of what this video is about. But when I refresh my page, none of those changes are saved, so it's not really useful having a drag and drop functionality if you can't communicate with the rest of your application to update those changes. Because right now, this entire drag and drop library that we just wrote, it's all self-contained, which is great, but it can't communicate outward. None of this code can tell other pieces of the code when things have changed. So inside of our script, we have no way of knowing when, for example, our drag and drop has ended, when our items have moved, where they've moved to. We want to implement that functionality. The easiest way to do that is when we set up our drag and drop, all we need to do is pass in a function that we can call when a drag finishes. So we can call this onDragComplete, which is just a function, a callback essentially, that every time we do a drag and drop, we want to tell the user that happened. So now when we set up our drag events, let's just pass in that function. And then all the way down here, when we lift up our mouse and we specifically have a drop zone, I want to tell the element where it moved to. So we can call this onDragComplete, and we can pass whatever we want to this. I just want to pass the most important information. Essentially, where did my item start? Where did it end? And which item did I move? That way they have all the information they need in order to, move this item between different lists or whatever it is when they're saving things. So we can have our start zone. Our start zone is really simple. It's just our selected item. We need to make sure we do this before we insert our item. So here we just get the drop zone for our selected item. And that's because we never moved our selected item. We just hit it. So it's still in its original zone that it started in. Then for our end zone, essentially that's just the current drop zone. We already have that. It's the drop zone that our ghost is in. So we have our end. We have our drag element. That's just our selected item, the thing that we're moving. And then finally, this is a little bit of a bonus. You don't need to do this, but I want to add the index as well, essentially the position in the list. So this would be an index of 1, index 0, index 2 in our list to determine what position we drag our element into. So to do that, just get our drop zone children. And again, I'm going to convert this to an array just to make it easier to work with. So array.from, and that's because arrays have a method called index of, and we can get the index of, which we know is inside of our drop zone. And since we're replacing our ghost with our selected item, that's also going to be the index of where we place our selected item. So there we go. That's all we need to do to update our code when a drag is complete. Now in our script, we can just have a function. We're going to call this onDragComplete and create a function onDragComplete, which is going to take in our event. And let's just console.log out what this event looks like. So let's inspect our page, go to the console, drag something over here. And of course, we get an uncaught referencer onDragComplete is not defined. HTML document add event listener once, drag and drop 58. So let's see exactly what's going on. says right here, on drag complete is not defined. And I think I already know the reason why. If we come over here, scroll up, I never included it in the parameters on drag complete. And that's because way up here, we passed it in, but I never actually pulled it into the function. So now we drag an item, it works. Let's inspect to see what the output is. Go to the console, we get an object, which has our drag element. And if I hover this, you can see that it's the element we just drug, the edit items. You'll see it over here. Our end zone is the one we drag it into. Our start zone is the one we drag it from. And we have an index of 1 because we drug it below record video. I drag it above. Check over here. Our start zone is the same as our end zone. Our item is still edit item. And now our index is 0 because it's the first one in the list. And just like an array, we're doing a 0-based index system. So with that one simple function, we've essentially completely changed how this works. We created a black box, which generally when people think of black boxes, they think of bad things because they can't look in and see what the black box does. But in coding, black boxes and abstractions where you take certain code and make it so you never have to look at it is really good. Because now in our script, we don't care what setup drag and drop does. All we care is that when we drag something and drop it, it's going to call this function and tell us where it came from, where it went, what it was, and what position it is. So we essentially made it so that all of the code in here, we don't care about. Just close it. It doesn't matter. When we're writing our application, we just know that we call setup drag and drop, pass it the on drag complete, and then what's going to happen is it's going to tell us whenever drags occur. This is super, super useful. Pretty much any time that you can abstract code away and make it so you don't have to understand what it does in order to do something else is crucial. That makes your life so much easier. Because now when we're building out this Trello functionality of saving and adding tasks, we don't need to remember, oh wait, how did the drag and drop work when we moved our mouse? It doesn't matter how that worked because all we care about is right here on drag complete. As long as this works, we don't have to care at all about drag and drop, which is great, especially when we move it to a new project. All you need to do is this simple little code and it's going to be working flawlessly. So in order to actually make our Trello functionality, this is going to be fairly similar to like an advanced to-do list, but we have these lanes that we can drag up items between, which makes it quite a bit more than just a normal to-do list, which is why I think it's important to go over. Also, we need to make sure that we have the lanes that we're going to be dragging between set up for each one of our users, and we need to save this inside of local storage because the lanes are going to be tied to what we're moving the items in between. So we can't have our lanes hard-coded in our HTML, because otherwise, how would we link our lanes to our actual JavaScript that's being stored? It would just make things a little bit more confusing. So I think it would be much easier if we make it so that our lanes are going to be inside of our JavaScript and not inside of our HTML. So instead of our JavaScript, I just want to set up our default lanes. So we can say default lanes is going to be equal to an object, and our lane is just going to have a name. So backlog is our first lane over here. So we can say backlog. And this backlog lane, all it's going to do is have some items inside of it, an array. Then we're going to have our next, which is the doing column. Again, it's just going to have an array of items. Then we're going to have our done column with an array of items. So now we essentially have our hard-coded HTML inside of our lanes. And for now, that's fine. We don't have the ability to add or delete lanes, so just hard-coding this between our HTML and our JavaScript is completely fine. If you want to, for example, make it so that they can add and remove lanes, you'll have to do this slightly differently, but I leave that as an exercise to you if you want to pursue that task, because I think that would be a great way to improve upon this project after this tutorial. So inside of our backlog, I also want to add one default task. So this is just going to imagine that this is the first time someone logs into this Trello clone. So the first task is probably going to be something along the lines of creating a new task. So we'll just make this task called be create your first task. There we go. So that's what the text is going to be. And then we need an ID to reference this. And we could, like hard code an ID1, for example, but I want to use a library which is going to generate IDs for us. An easy way to do that is just if we install the library UUID. We've used this before, I believe. So we're just going to install UUID. And then up here, we just want to come in and import v4 as UUID v4 from UUID. And then what we can do is just call UUID v4, and we're going to get a random ID for our default lanes. And if I just said console.log default lanes, and I inspect our page, we should get this list of an object which has backlog, which has that one ID and a text to create your first task. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to render out these default lanes. But instead of rendering out just the default lanes, I want to load any lanes we currently have. So I can say lanes is equal to load lanes. And we can create a function down here called load lanes. All this is going to do is get this from local storage. So we can say lanes JSON is equal to local storage dot get item. We have to pass in our key. So we'll call this lanes storage key. Then what we can do is create that. So up here, we can just say const lanes storage key. And also, since I always like to do a prefix, I'm going to call this storage prefix. I'm going to set that equal to Trello Clone. And then for our lanes, all we need to do is just append that lane storage prefix. And then we'll just call this hyphen lanes. So that's our key that we just created. And then now that we have that, down here in our load lanes, we can just return lanes JSON. We need to JSON.stringify this. Lanes JSON, or we're just going to return our default lanes. So if we don't have anything, we're going to return our default lanes. Otherwise, we'll load what we have. And now let's just console log our lanes, and we should get our default lanes being printed out, because right now we don't have any information saved. And if we look, we're getting null printed out. The reason for that, if we scroll down here, this should be JSON.parse, because we want to parse a string into JSON. Now if we inspect, go to the console, you can see we're getting our default lanes being printed, which is exactly what we want, because right now there's no lanes currently saved. So now once we load our lanes, I want to render our lanes. So we're just going to call a task called render tasks, because we want to render the tasks in each one of those lanes. And we'll just create a function called render tasks. For now, I'm not going to do anything in here because I need to set up our HTML to actually render our tasks properly from our lanes. So inside of here, we need to remove all the tasks that we currently have. So these tasks, gone. Inside of here, we also have tasks, remove those. And inside of here, we also have tasks, we need to remove those. For now, I'm just going to comment this one out so we have a reference to what our task looked like. So when we create our tasks, we can create it to look just like this. But when I save, you can see it removes all of our tasks. Also, I need a way to be able to connect this hard-coded HTML to our saved here default lanes. So we can use these keys, backlog, doing, and done. In here, for our tasks, I can just say data, lane, ID, and this one is backlog. I can copy this down to our next lane down here, and this one is for doing. And then finally copy this down to our last lane, which is called done. That way we can essentially take the key of our object here, backlog, doing, or done, and convert that to an HTML element. So now in our render tasks, we just need to loop through each one of our lanes. So in order to loop through an object, it's a little bit different. You can't just say like object.forEach. Instead, you need to use an uppercase object. This is like if we were to do uppercase array, we're just referencing this object class, say dot, and we can say entries. What this allows us to do is convert our object to an array, essentially. So here, entries is going to convert our object to an array. So let's say that we had the object that was A and 1, just like this. What this is going to do, and we'll actually put in another thing here, B and 2. This is going to convert to the array of A, 1, and B2. So it's going to be an array, and for each element in that array is another array where the first element is the key and the second element is the value. That's what object.entries does. So now we can loop through each one of these entries, and each one of these entries is just an object, and we can get the lane ID, which is just the first element of this, and we can get the tasks, which is the second element in this array. So from our lane ID, we can actually get the lane. So we can say our lane is equal to document.query selector. And if you remember, in our index.html, we added this data lane ID. So let's just copy this whole thing, paste it in here. We need to put this inside of brackets. And what we want to do is replace this done section. We want to replace this with our lane ID. So for each one of our lane IDs, when we have the data lane ID equal to that, we're going to select that lane. Then I just want to loop through each one of our tasks. So for each one of our tasks, I want to create a task element. So we'll say task element is equal to create task element. We're just going to create this function, and we're going to pass it in our task, just like this. And then I want to take our lane, and I want to append that task element. So we'll append the task element, and then we'll create the function for creating a task element, which takes in a task. This is where it's really important to have kept this task here. Let me just copy this. So it's now deleted. We're going to paste it into our script here, just so we can kind of reference what our task looks like. It is a div. So we can say element is equal to document create element of a div. We know that the text is going to be our task.text. So we can just say element.inner text is equal to task.text. We also know that it has the class text and this data attribute draggable. So element.class list an add of task and element.dataset.draggable. And we're just going to set that equal to true. Finally, I also want to add in the ID. So we could say like ID equals 1, for example. So we get that from our task. So we'll say element.id equals task.id. That way we can reference the element based on the ID that we're getting when we're doing our drag and drop. Now, finally, I just want to return the element that we recreated. And that's all we need to do to create a task element. And we're appending it here. So when we save, obviously nothing's happening. And that's just because we need to make sure we call render tasks, which we are calling. So down here, we need to pass our lanes to object.entries. I forgot to do that. Now if we save, you can see our task is right here. We can drag it around just as we would expect. And it's showing up in the backlog column because that's where we're saving it. If we were to move this into the doing column, you can see it moved over there. So that at least our default lanes are working as we would expect. Now the next step is to be able to make it so when we move our element here, it actually updates our lanes right here. So we're going to do that in our drag complete. We can get our start lane ID, which is just e.start zone, which is wherever we started from. And remember, we have that data attribute, which we can get, which is the lane ID. We can also just copy this and get the end lane ID, which is just this exact same thing, but for the end zone. Then we want to get the start lane tasks. These are the tasks inside of the start lane, which is just lanes of our start lane ID. And we're using this bracket notation here because we want to access a property of an object based on a variable. So we can't just say dot start lane ID because I would try to access a property called start lane ID. We want to actually get to the property of this variable, which is where this bracket notation comes in. Now we can do the same thing to get the tasks in the end of our list, just like this. And all we need to do is essentially move the task from the start of our list to our end list, and we need to make sure it's in the correct position. This is a little bit tricky, but it's not too difficult. So the first thing I want to do is get the task from our start list. So we can say our task is going to come from our start lane tasks. And I want to find the element based on the ID. So we're just going to have a task. So our task.id is equal to the element we're currently dragging, which is our e.drag element. We want to get the ID of that. And that's because down here, we set our ID on our element, so we can get the ID from our element and associate it with the task. Then what we can do is we can take our start lane tasks and our end lane task. And all we need to do inside of here, if I can spell properly, is we need to make sure that we remove our task from the start and add it to the end. And to do that, we can use the same function, splice. This allows us to essentially remove certain elements in an array or remove and replace elements inside of an array. So for the first one, we just want to remove elements in an array. We want to remove elements starting at a specific index. So we want to get the index of our task, which is the start lane tasks, and we want to get the index of that task. This is the index of the current task we're starting with, and we want to remove one element starting at that index, which is removing itself. Then down here, with our splice, what we want to do is start at the index that we get from our event. That's the final place we added our event. We want to remove 0 things, so we don't want to remove anything, but we want to insert our task at that location. That's what this splice is doing, and make sure this is our end lane tasks. Now, when we save this, and if we just come in here and console.log our lanes, we should see something interesting. So let's inspect our page, go to the console, drag this over. You can see our lanes now. In the doing, we have our event. If we drag it back to backlog, it is now in the backlog array, as you can see here. Drag it over to done, and it's now in that done array. So the way that this splice works is the first property you pass is the index you start at. In our case, this is the 0th index, and we want to delete one element. Down here, we're starting at the index of where we drag that element to, deleting 0 elements, but adding one element at that location, in our case, the task. So we're just moving it from one list to the other list. That's all we're doing. And now instead of logging out those lanes, let's actually save them. So we'll create a function called save lanes, and we'll just put it right here, save lanes. And this is only just going to access local storage, set an item at the lane storage key, and we just want to JSON.stringify our lanes. Now, if we save this, move this item and refresh, it should stay there. And of course, it's working as we would expect. And if we were to go and inspect, go to our application, local storage, you can see here that our lanes are being properly tracked. And as we move this around, it's updating inside of our local storage, which is why when we refresh, it's showing up in the right place. Now, our final task that we have left, since we have drag and drop working, we're rendering everything, we're properly doing everything for saving. All we need to do is make sure that our form down here is able to add a task for us. So I want to be able to select this form inside of our JavaScript. So let's make sure we have some selectors here. We'll do a data task form, and down here we'll have a data task input, just so we can select these in the JavaScript. Then in here, we're going to do another global event listener for each one of the forms that we're setting up. That way, if eventually we make it so we can dynamically add new lanes that we can drag to, it'll make sure it still hooks up the events for the forms that are new being added to our page. So let's import that global event listener, which we can just copy from here all the way up here. Let's just copy this line and we'll paste it in here. So we're getting that add global event listener, and I'll just come down here. I'm going to call add global event listener, and this is going to be for submit, when we submit a form, and we want it to be for when we submit, one of our data task forms. And we're going to call this event. First thing we do with a form, we want to prevent the default so it doesn't submit our page. Then we're going to go through and get the text inside of the task and create a new task for it. So to do that, let's just get our task input, which is e.target.querySelector. So this is selecting our form. And now we want to select the data task input for that specific form. The next thing we need to do is get the text of our task. So we'll say task text is equal to task input dot value. And then if our task text is equal to an empty string, we just want to essentially return, because if we don't have anything to actually create an event for, we just need to return and not create a task. Now what we need to do is get the lane to add the task to and create the task. So let's create the task first. It's just going to be an object with an ID, which we're going to create with that UUID, and our text is our task text, just like that. Then we're going to get our lane. We want to get the element of our lane, and this is just going to be our target, which is our form. We want to get the closest parent, which our parent we know, we go back to our index.html, has this data lane ID attribute. We can't actually get this directly from our form. We need to first get the parent, which has a class of lane, and then get a child, which has this data lane ID. So we want to get the closest parent that has the class lane, and then inside of there, we want to get the child, which has the data lane ID attribute. And make sure I spell selector properly. And this allows us to get a lane and then get the child that has the correct lane ID. That's our lane element where we're going to be adding our task to. Then we can take our lanes for our lane element, and we want to get the dataset.lane ID. This is the ID, essentially the property in our lanes object that we want to add this to. And all we need to do here is just call push and push in our task. Then finally, all the way down here, we can create our task element, which is just create task element, pass in our task. Then we can take our lane element and we can append our task element to it. And finally, we can take our task input, clear out the value, and save our lanes. So that is a lot of code that we just wrote. So let's make sure that it actually works. Let's create a new task, hit enter. As you can see, it refreshed our form. So clearly something didn't quite work as expected. What we need to do is go look at our HTML to make sure we have this data task form set up. We have it set up here on this form, but on this form we don't, and on this form we don't. And we also need to make sure that our inputs have the data task input on them. So let's just copy this to each one of our inputs, just like that. And now let's see if this works. New task, enter. As you can see, it created a new task. We refresh, it's still there. We can move it around. Let's create another task. We can move this one around. We can create a really long task to see how it works with wrapping. As you can see, this works as we would expect. Refresh, and everything stays in the same place. And that's all it takes to create this Trello clone focused on drag and drop. If you want to take this project to the next level and add extra features to it, there are two things I would recommend doing. Number one, which is the easier of the two, is add a button somewhere or an ability for a person to download their tasks and then another button to upload their tasks. All this would do is, if we come into our script here, it would just take the lanes and give them a JSON output of all of the different lanes. And then they can copy that JSON output and paste it into somewhere else when they click an upload button. And that allows them to take their tasks from one computer to another, because right now this is all local storage based. So it's a great, pretty easy task that you can accomplish. The second task is quite a bit more involved. That will be to add the ability for users to create their own lanes. So right now we have these hard-coded ones. But let's say you wanted to create a new lane, which is called to do or something. Add the ability for the user to click a button or whatever and add a new lane, and then be able to drag tasks between the old lanes and the new lane, and just essentially work flawlessly with the ability to add new lanes. That would be the next task to complete, and that's quite a bit more involved, but it's a great next step for this project. Other than that, all I want you to do is remember that when you're going to clone a project, to really focus on what you want to learn when you build that clone, and focus on building just that component instead of building the entire application exactly as it is. You may notice here our CSS styles are super basic and look nothing like Trello, but we're not learning CSS, so there's no point in fussing over getting the exact pixel perfect CSS, when instead we can focus on the drag and drop functionality, which is the core thing learned in the project. So when you do build your next project and your next clone, make sure to really focus on what you want to learn from it and focus on building just that component.